Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of Read TFOS, where I take old stories I've narrated and update into modern audio standards. Among the Humans, written by Lost War. Brittana had been a researcher for a long time with the Council. Her job was to study new species and to try and understand them, see how they fit into the universe as a whole. Her race was a race of scientists. They were the Council's explorers and high scholars. She and her military attaché, Toma, of the Reneth, had discovered what the first thought was a primitive race. Initial scans had indicated no presence of wildling technology, just some large cities. It should have been easy to come close enough to study them. They were surprised that almost immediately they were noticed. Suddenly, they detected aircraft approaching at speeds that should not have been achievable without the technology of the wildlings. The scanners indicated that they were being hailed, but the translators didn't understand the language. They were still building up the vocabulary from the radio waves they picked up. Suddenly, the translator said, "Unknown craft, we will open fire." This race was more sophisticated than they had expected. What's more, none of the wildling technology was detected. Had they truly developed aircraft independent of all known technology capable of intercepting their exploration craft? Suddenly, something incredibly powerful slammed into their shields. The people of this planet had opened fire. Putting their craft at max speed, they rushed away from the engaging craft. "Rita, we don't know who this race is or the technology they utilize. We need to get out of here," Toma yelled. "We need to take a specimen to study. We can't stay around here, and we'll know nothing about this race if we don't." Seth and his brother had been on their way home, riding their bikes on that cloudy night. They had stayed later than they should have at their friend's house and knew their mother would be worried. The rural area they lived in was always a quiet area. No one in the area was particularly well off, but none went hungry. The youths had only experienced their parents' love and a tight-knit community. Hard work was the norm in that community. Even the young had more chores, driving a higher level of maturity than is normally seen from their urban youths. As they barreled down the dusty dirt road, they saw something unexpected, a bright flash of light. Seth briefly thought that they were being hit by a truck before the entire world went white. In the back of his mind, he flashed on his family. Ritala had barely been able to breathe until they had exited the system. Those airships that fired intelligent rockets kept appearing. Every time they thought that they were free, more would show up. Even as they had left the atmosphere, the ship had narrowly avoided larger rockets that chased them. Now safely away from the hostile planet, she was finally able to relax and think calmly. Ritala sat on the observation deck and watched her newer specimens. They had been lucky to catch the two of them in a remote part of the country under the cover of darkness. They had already put on the contraptions that they were riding into storage for study. This new race was fascinating. This race had obviously not been gifted the technology of the wildlings, yet seemed to be creating airships and vehicles using completely alien technologies. They flew without anti-gravity. Their rockets could change direction and chase their targets. They moved along the ground in vehicles at incredibly dangerous speeds. The pair Ritala and Toma had managed to collect of this intriguing species had been spotted on a path in the woods. Luckily, at that moment, the aircraft that had hounded them were not in sight. Seeing the opportunity, Ritala had Toma capture them before heading back to the safety of space as fast as they could. One with red hair and fair complexion, while the other had black hair. The second one had a crooked nose, apparently from a traumatic facial injury that he had endured at some point. His face had hard lines the other boy completely lacked, and the darker pigmentation of his skin. Again, she sat and studied the charts. All of the testing indicated these two were closely matched genetically, likely siblings. But how could any mated pair produce two beings so similar, yet so different? Turning towards Toma, Arales, the council's secretary, "Tell me, Toma, what do you see here?" In the formal stiffness of the Relith military, Toma replied, "A severe violation of non-interference laws, ma'am. Also 2 unconscious primitives." Ritala had to chuckle. Toma was so literal and stiff. Even after all their years traveling together, she still wasn't used to it. "I mean, what is your impression of the two?" After a moment of sudden silence, "Ma'am, they appear very different. This is the first species close to matching the ancient description of wildlings, but they lack the sophistication described. Maybe such variance is seen among their species, and we just happen to catch some that happen to resemble the ancient text." "They are brothers, Toma." Ritala took a moment to enjoy the brief expression of surprise Toma quickly suppressed. Such variation in the species was not unknown, but between one so closely related was almost unheard of. Ritala let out a gasp as the two specimens started to wake up and move about. The two primitives began speaking to each other, gesturing with their upper limbs. Based on samples gathered during the harrowing escape, the translator had been able to work out quite a bit of the language. She had collected the two specimens in an impulsive move of desperation. In the past, she had collected other specimens, studied them, and then later left them on the planet with no memory of the event. While the collection was successful, the persistent pursuit by primitives had forced her to rush the collection process. And now that the two specimen samples had awoken, she could not just return them. She knew that she would face a council upon her return. She would likely lose her rank and ship for this. This was barely registered in her mind before she realized the creatures looked like the ancients' depictions of the wildlings. If they were, this would be the greatest find in their history. The wildlings were thought to be almost myth, a race described in only the ancient texts. The two primitives appeared to be aware that they were being observed, but did not seem to show much fear compared to the other races in first contacts. Immediately, she began to wonder how this species, primitive without even the outpost other than its home planet, could not be terrified upon awakening in what should be a very foreign environment, a holding room in a spaceship. The red-haired one the translator had figured out was called Seth. He kept waving and pointing at them. The other just seemed to stand back and watch them. Such different reactions. The enigma of this race just seemed to grow. Seth kept calling her Elf Lady, which the translator treated as a proper name. He would also wave at Toma, calling him a dwarf. She had no clue what nerd, Dungeons & Dragons, or Star Trek were. Toma, it would appear they have noticed you as well, he shared with a sad smile. Obviously unmused with the situation, Toma replied, They obviously have no clue what we are. What possessed you to grab two of the species that were shooting at us? I don't know. Well, truth be told, it was the technology they were using. These creatures are using technology based on the wildling tech everyone else uses. We've never encountered a race like this, Ritala started with a frown. Seth looked around. They were in a circular white room. Kenan, Seth begged, wake up. We didn't make it home. I think we may be in some sort of hospital. A low growl came from Kenan as he slowly started to move, his movements making his pain evident. How's bells, Seth? This ain't Dr. Smith's place. What happened, and why are you on the floor? Kenan groaned, starting to race off the floor. Slowly, they started getting to their feet. Seth, I don't think we're in a hospital, Kenan says as he points upwards. Sure hope this is one of those practical joke TV shows. Following Kenan's gesture, Seth found a strange sight staring back at him. Is that an elf? Kenan just nodded. Looks like it. Then Seth pointed at the shorter alien. And a dwarf? Damn, Seth. They look like Dungeons & Dragons players going to a Star Trek convention in those silver onesies, Kenan sighed in despair. Seth just started laughing. That's a hell of a mental image. Hey, we have been kidnapped by space nerds. Kenan just shot him an annoyed glare. Suddenly, Kenan realized something was wrong. His bicycle was not there, and Kenan had worked and saved for over 2 years to buy that bicycle. Instead of humor, he felt his temper beginning to bubble. He looked over at his brother, making a fool of himself. Seth, I don't think they're going to say much to us, Kenan growled. To himself, Kenan began to recite his father's advice to him. Master your anger. If you do not, the beast awaits outside the door, and it'll consume you. He knew he needed to keep a level head, but that was his damn bicycle. Kenan, I'm afraid. What are they planning on doing with us? Will we ever get to see Mom and Dad again? Kenan heard his brother say. I don't know, Kenan admitted. But Seth, whatever happens, we stick together. I want my bicycle back, and I want to go home. Kenan found himself grumbling. His anger almost evaporated in surprise when he heard his brother laugh. You're worried about your bicycle right now? Seth asked. As Ritala's ship, along with its unwitting passengers, made its way to the council, Ritala used the time to prepare to defend her actions. She and Toma had started to have some discussions with her specimens, and were quickly surprised at how well they seemed to grasp the situation. Toma had actually shocked her, laughing at the relief the specimens had showed once she had explained there was no probes being installed. They still seemed to insist on calling her elf and him dwarf, despite being corrected. The one called Seth seemed to be more talkative than the one called Kenan. She was hesitant to take them before the council, but ultimately decided it was the best chance. It was so strange compared to other known species. Councillors, if you review our initial scans of the footage and our account of the flying craft, you'll see no signs of wildling technology. Yet they are doing things no other race has, Ritala protested. Think of what we could learn from them. Councillor Nicole, a fellow Lavon, glared down at Ritala. We have laws regarding interference with primitive races for a reason. They haven't even discovered welding technology yet. Your first contact with this race was violent. What precedent does this set for our future interactions? You are a Lavore explorer and know better. Counselor, I know what I did was against the rules. I did it out of desperation, but given their bizarre technology and looks, I think these might be wildlings. Ratala almost begged as she had the bikes brought out. The counselors could be seen leaning forward to look. Look at these devices they were using for transportations. These were some of the most basic of what we scanned while fleeing their military. Hey, that's my damn bike, you thieving piece of shit, Cannon roared, seeing his bicycle being presented. His face beat red in his anger. The whole council stopped and looked hard at Cannon at that. Councillor Nokal was first to speak. Ratala, you brought the specimens here and didn't even teach them how to address the council, he stated coldly. Looking at Cannon and Seth, who are you, and what do you call yourselves? I'm Seth, and this is my brother Cannon. We are humans. My brother is right. Those are our bicycles, though, Seth said, heading off the more colourful response he could almost read on his brother's face. Councillor Nokal at this seemed to regard both boys for a few minutes, then rising from his chair, walked over and examined the bicycles. Almost immediately, he noticed how unstable they were as he knocked one over. Hey! Cannon managed to get out before Seth shushed him. Looking it over, the strange vehicle seemed to have gearing of some sort. At first it had appeared simple, but the closer he looked, the more he saw levers, wires, gears, and even motion-arrested devices. He could not deny the resemblance between these boys and the depictions of wildlings their ancient texts had. The ancient texts described wildlings as creatures who bent the very nature of reality to meet their needs. These two obviously didn't possess power of anything near this realm. This was turning into the strangest first context he had ever seen, though. They did not show fear, but defiance, as they looked upon the council. Tell me, humans, why are you not intimidated by what stands before you? Councillor Nokal started. Have you seen anything similar before? Why do you look like wildlings? Seth started to answer, but Cannon beat him to it. Why would we be intimidated? We're being interrogated by the cast of The Lord of the Rings in space. You could have found a better set. The Death Star was far more impressive before it was destroyed. This is just one of those stupid 50s sci-fi shows. You all have mentioned it several times, but what the hell is a wildling? The entire council gasped at this. While they did not know the Lord of the Rings or Death Star was, the primitive race clearly wasn't awed by the council's might. Neither had they seen a first contact show such defiance. Ratala, you will be responsible for these humans and see to their integration into our society. They cannot go home now that they have seen this much of our technology. We will send the bicycles to the lab to be studied. Councillor Nokal stated, leveling his cold gaze at Ratala while pointedly ignoring Seth and Cannon after this display of defiance. At least we got the hot elf and not the hairy little dwarf, Cannon muttered, just a little too loudly. Seth threw an elbow to quiet him, but not fast enough. Most just stared at the two boys, except Councillor Nokal, who was still clearly ignoring them. Dispatch observer probes to monitor this race. This meeting is done, Councillor Nokal said through gritted teeth. He could not believe the insolence of these humans had displayed. They were specimens and completely at their mercy, yet had asked for none. When the humans had first been collected, Ratala had thought them to be slight in frame like the Lavore and short like Thomas people. With each passing cycle, though, they were continuing to grow. Soon Ratala began to realize that they were youths. If not for their hostile reaction to their approach, they would have done more research and targeted fully matured adults. Now, the humans were beginning to almost get as tall as the Lavore, yet their bodies thickened like Toma. Fear setting in, Ratala finally asked one day, Seth, are you and your brother adults? This caused Seth to start to laugh. No, we're just in elementary school. You didn't know we were kids, Cannon asked suddenly. Eyes widened, Ratala responded, of course not. I would never have taken you had I known. Then in a softer voice, already afraid of what would come, she asked, what was your home like? At this, the boys started talking, first about their parents, friends, and neighbors. After a while, they also talked about the chores country kids do, taking care of domesticated animals. Finally, they started talking about the community, church, and schools they attended. As she talked to them, Ratala couldn't help but begin to feel an immense guilt. She'd taken a race's youth. She suddenly hoped they weren't wildlings, but watching them and knowing their youth became even more convinced. She remembered the description of wildling warriors, fighters who smiled in the face of danger. She approached the council several times over other concerns, but was dismissed. They did not believe her. Knowing their education was incomplete, though, she did enroll them in the best academy she could afford. It was an elite school for the gifted, which thankfully their sharp intellect had earned them a scholarship to attend. Instructor Nilo, a ripshaw, as though the boys tended to call him a lizard, was trying to teach a class full of students. All spacefaring races known today owe their technology to a single ancient race. If you look back in all races' history, you will find a common story and description of an ancient ruler from space who uplifted us. Seth cringed as he heard Kenan mutter, "Not in our textbooks." Nano just did his best to try and continue the lesson. At one point, a massive search was conducted to try and find out who they were and where they went. What little was known was that the wildlings had been an ancient race that once covered massive tracts of space. It was leftover wildling technology that had led to all the races to leave their planets and settle others. Races who have yet to utilize this technology are strictly off-limits. That is in many ways a rite of passage, showing you understand the wildling gifts. Most aggressive races were never gifted. This rule was created to protect all parties. A young female ripshaw named Rolla piped up, "Where I grew up, there are still wildling buildings, even after all this time." "What did they look like?" Seth asked. As he asked this, everyone went quiet. "The buildings were stone, but shaped like a giant column with holes in it. The more conventional buildings were all gone, but these stone buildings were just stayed," Rolla quickly replied. "It is interesting you should have such a keen interest in this subject. Did you know that the wildlings are described as being similar to you and your brother, but taller with highly advanced technology? They were also said to be hard-headed," Nilo said with a chuckle. Then he began to explain. "You must understand that the wildlings were known as such for a reason. They were considered in many of their ancient texts to be creatures of chaos. Most ancient myths had the wildlings conducting massive wars against themselves. None of the ancient races dared attack them. In space, they had never unified as other races did, but instead competed unless one faction was attacked. To attack a wildling nation would draw the counter-response against your race. They killed wilds in their vengeance, turning entire surfaces to glass and ash." "Sounds familiar," Kenan stated. Rhoda excitedly asked, "I thought you didn't know who they were. You have legends about them too?" Kenan just looked at her. "Do your people not fight amongst themselves?" Rhoda just shook her head. No. A strange look on her face. "Wars happen between species. Everyone knows violent species rarely manage to get off-world because the wildlings didn't give them the gifts of travel." "Very good, Roller," Nilo continued. "This perpetual state of competition is what really made the wildlings different, and is what fueled their technological advancements. That is, up until they suddenly self-destructed. While some wildling nations were said to be benevolent and helped primitive races, others would enslave primitive races. Almost none tolerate threats to their power, though. Races deemed too violent were either left alone or wiped out." "Good thing we weren't coming from school when they kidnapped us, Seth. Hate to let them read our history books if they'd find this shocking," Kenan chuckled. Nilo pressed on. "It is not a mystery how the wildlings brought about their own end. The ancient records of our races tell the wildlings created a virus to end the war with themselves. That tinkering with life was what ultimately killed them. All that was left was their technology. A few mummified remains and stories. This is important to remember when we explore or study technology." "Oh man," Seth sighed, shaking his head. Only he heard Kenan chuckle. "Yeah, that sounds about right." Ritala was constantly amazed by what she could see in the boys. Both were skilled in their dealings with others. Seth was extremely popular, while Kenan seemed to cast shadow few dared cross. Both, in their own way, were highly respected by other races in the academy. An interesting duality was seen in both. They seemed to grasp almost any course or technology put in front of them quickly. Yet their instructors would often suffer under the constant barrage of whys and hows until they either grasped the underlying principles or decided the professor didn't know. What Ritala saw that the others didn't, though, was how they would apply those studies. It wasn't enough for them to learn. They had to understand and try. She often found herself reflecting upon her own years as a student, striving to memorize what she was told. Neither of the boys could just accept something. She still remembered the shock of coming into her apartment to find that they had disassembled the anti-grav unit. They swore they would fix it, but she hadn't let them for fear that they would get hurt. It had been thrown out. Welding technology was too dangerous to be left in the hands of kids. "Britannia, what will happen to us when we grow up?" Seth was asking. Cannon listened carefully. He had a plan, but now was not the time. He promised his brother they would go home if he meant it. Britannia seemed confused. "As your guardian, I first need to see to your education. After that, you can earn a place in our society. Being the only of your race will make it difficult, but not impossible." Seth seemed to contemplate this a while, then asked, "Would we be able to go home?" Cannon looked up at this, then to Rutala. "The council won't allow it. They don't believe that you are wildlings, so your system is officially off limits until your species finds their wildling technology and figures out how to go to space. I'm afraid that such things likely won't happen in your lifetimes," she responded, guilt in her voice. "Why won't the council allow it? Do they fear our return?" Cannon suddenly asked. "The council does not believe truly wildlings. They believe you share an appearance and seem to be innovative beyond normal, but your technology just isn't as advanced. They worry that we will influence your race's development. I've also heard that they are concerned by some of what the probes have shown them. Long ago, a primitive race wiped themselves out because of advanced civilization gave them technology they weren't ready for," Rutala carefully said. "Can I have my bike back?" Cannon asked, his favorite question when he got frustrated. With a gentle smile, she said, "I'm sorry, but I never got it back." Cannon looked back down at the book he was reading. He calmly continued to study. Someday, he would get free, he thought to himself, his initial anger having hardened into his veins through sheer determination. He didn't care what rules the council said there was. They weren't his parents, and they still had his damn bike. As Rutala had watched the boys grow, both in size and strength, she couldn't help but also feel the sense of attachment to them both. Seth was always the happy one, the one who was eager to engage and popular around other species' youth. Cannon was equally gifted, able to quickly understand almost anything he got his hands on. Where Seth was happy, though, Cannon was always a little sullen. Rutala still marveled at the two brothers. Seth was popular and had a knack with wording. All his teachers liked him. It was like a warm beam of light in the study rooms. Cannon, by comparison, was sharp, already far beyond his peers in his studies. He was not a nice kid, but generally kept to himself. Most of his peers were more than willing to let him. She still remembers how she had been called to the academy after he had fought several older students. One foolish Raneth had thought himself intimidating and tried to bully Cannon with his friends. It took 3 teachers and a security guard to pull him off those students. The ferocity of his attack and the damage he inflicted had been the talk for days. Thankfully, he was all caught on camera, but everyone looked at both boys differently after that. The Raneth were also relieved that Cannon's improvised dwarf bowling did not become popular. How could he be so different? For a long time she hoped that it would resolve itself, but it never did until one day she decided to approach Seth about it. "Hello, Seth. How has your day been?" she asked as casually as she could. "Good, Rutala. Met several new students at the school," Seth proudly proclaimed. "They are also teaching us about welding technology." This took Rutala off guard. She could no longer associate the two boys with the legendary creatures of chaos. As she had gotten to know them, they were not that different beyond intense curiosity. "You shouldn't worry about the ancient myths, Seth. I was wanting to talk to you about something else. How is your brother Cannon doing?" "Dad always said that Cannon has a monster inside of him he must learn to control. Anger is very strong in him, and since we were taken, it has gotten worse. For us, it can be a strength. In times I want to give up, he will push on, but it's also toxic. It makes him push others away. He sometimes doesn't know how to express himself," Seth explained, eyes downcast at the table. Rutala thought on that a moment. Most species she had studied normally fit within a rather tight band emotionally. Yet here she had 2 humans who were extremely far apart, who were siblings. "Is this usual for humans?" Seth looked at her with an innocent smile. "Don't mistake Cannon's struggle. The anger isn't always at someone. Sometimes it's a situation or an object. He will never be satisfied if he keeps indulging in it. It'll drive him, but also deny him happiness and the ability to enjoy things as they are." "Thank you, Seth. I think that helps." As she watched Seth leave, Rutala caught a glimpse of movement near the door. Cannon had been listening. Without even thinking about it, she called out to him. He came back. "Yes, Rutala?" The words, always polite, but something defiant in how they said, or maybe it was the burning intensity of his stare. "I was only asking as I was worried about you. You seem so different from your brother," Rutala began to explain. "Rutala, I am not my brother, nor his keeper. He is my brother, and I will protect him, but we do not belong here. I thank you for your care that you have given us. You have always been kind, but I wish you left us where you found us," he stated. Ritala was taken aback. Kenan was always distant. She had very few conversations with him. Those she did were generally short exchanges or sarcastic comments. This was the most he'd talked to her since his arrival. Letting out a breath she didn't know she was holding, she felt the tears start to form. It was guilt. She understood the council's rules, but it was worse somehow knowing that she took young. In shame, she started to lower her head into her hands. Ritala actually jumped when she heard the sound of a seat being pulled out. Opposite of her, Kenan sat down. Looking into his eyes, she could see a storm of emotions. His face was calm, but his eyes behind were more emotion than she would have believed possible. He quietly continued, "I'm sorry, Ritala. I hated you at first. Thought of you as more warden than a guardian. Seth and I weren't orphans or street kids who with no one would miss. It hurt to leave our families, friends, and everything we had known. Don't expect us to stay here just because your council says we have to." "I'm sorry, Kenan. We didn't even realize that you were kids at the time. We were panicked after the encounters with your aircraft. I should never have taken any specimens, but after your racist technology was so different than we knew, I had hoped by showing them your bikes and resemblance to wildlings that they would send a delegation to welcome your race to the council," she began to explain. "Ritala, I forgive you. My father used to always say listen to what a person has to say, but watch their actions. The actions never lie. Your actions have protected us, provided for us, and even taught us your culture and ways. I read everything I could get my hands on and suspect you may be right. The humans could have once been the wildlings you reference. All of the behaviors, the differences in culture, even the fighting amongst ourselves fits. I'll go home eventually, and I hope my family's still there." It was odd, in a way. Talking to Seth was always fun, relaxing. Kenan was intense. It was uncomfortable to look at him in the eye and talk. His statements carried a conviction, though, that not only left little doubt that he believed, but almost forced you to believe also. "Kenan, I don't know what I deserve for your forgiveness, but thank you. And thank you for talking to me." She couldn't help but think about it. While her kind was long-lived, they tended to be more analytical. These boys may be full of emotion, but they could analyze the situation clearly. They learned at an astonishing pace, understanding in some cases far more than they let on. She felt pride at how they learned and adapted. They easily eclipsed the abilities of many racers she knew. They may be youths, but far eclipsed their peers. As she mulled this over, she realized these boys were not a research experiment to her. They had become her family. They had lived together for a few years now, and she was surprised how attached she had grown. She quickly resolved what she must do. That night she called Toma. She was going to take them back. After all the years they had worked together, he deserved to know. He warned her if she did, she could not come back. She already knew this, though. In some part of her mind, though, she felt exile might be just punishment for one who had stolen 2 children from their parents. Toma shocked her, though. "If you're set on doing it, then I'm coming with. Someone has to look after you all." Kenan left the room as confused by his emotions as by the discussion. He had always kept Ritala at arm's length. She had kidnapped him, after all, but he had seen her defense of them and the care she provided. The council had stripped her of her rank and position because of what she had done. In their case, she had gone out of her way in getting them into the best school that she could and always helped him in any resource he wanted to study. She was starting to feel like family. So when she started to cry, he couldn't stay mad. His anger evaporated in the face of genuine tears and regret. As he got into his room, he could feel his anger trying to come back, only not at Ritala. He pulled the anti-grav unit he had pulled from the trash and reassembled. As he looked at it, he thought about how he had studied everything he could find about the wildlings after the council meeting. He was convinced they were human. Earth had not always been humanity's only home, but now that we were confined to it, he even suspected that he knew the virus that almost wiped them out. It was what we now call the common cold. Those alive were those whose bodies adapted. After coming to that realization, he studied everything he could to get his hands on. He'd already made the anti-grav unit significantly stronger than it originally was. He was planning on putting it into a new bicycle. He sought to understand how the machines work, not just to work them like the aliens did. He carefully made notes on how FTL worked and took time studying what he could on the Council's history. Their technology was initially impressive until you realized that they didn't understand it. They were almost completely reliant on leftover wildling technology. While he had yet to go to college and study them, he already knew there were entire fields of study on Earth the Council races had not even considered. He wanted to just go home, but his anger had hardened into resolve that when he did, humans would come back to the galaxy. This council didn't understand human nature if they thought that he would just do what they asked because they said so. He was surprised when suddenly the door opened. It was Rutala. "Get you and your brother's stuff together quickly. We're leaving. Toma and I will take you home. He's on his way over." Kenan just sat in shock. He never expected this. "But what about you?" he found himself asking. "Guess I'll be living around humans. The council will never allow me back," Rutala said without even a hint of sadness. Kenan looked at her for a moment, feeling a bubble of hope and sadness at the same time. "We'll take care of you as you have us," he stated, carefully slipping the anti-grav unit into his bag. Earth was quickly approaching. They had already received notices from the councils to divert, following with the threat of criminal charges. Thomas, still shaking his head, asked Rutala, "You think they're going to try and shoot us down?" Puzzled, Rutala looked back at him. "The council generally doesn't for quarantine violations. A space battle could have an even greater impact on the quarantine race." Thomas smiled. "I mean the humans." Before Rutala could reply, the boys in chorus said yes. Toma took little solace in this. He couldn't let Rutala do this alone after all the time that they had worked together, but he really didn't look forward to a second encounter with a human aircraft. They hadn't even entered the atmosphere when the first radio transmission hit them. "Unidentified aircraft, identify yourself." Toma looked surprised, until he noticed there was a structure in low orbit, a space-based structure. How had they missed that the first time? Rutala took a deep breath and keyed the mic. "This is Rutala of the Redith. We come in peace to return some of your people." Everything was silent for several moments. Toma couldn't help but wonder if another of those infernal rockets was being shot their way. "Rutala, please proceed to enter atmosphere. We will send a guide craft to take you to the landing point." When the boys had disappeared, an entire rural community had been devastated. Despite all their efforts, no clues turned up. The house that once was full of happy noises of boys playing and parents trying to maintain control was suddenly very silent. Years passed, yet one of humanity's other defining traits showed: hope in the face of adversity. Yet the father always left the porch light on. He could often be seen sitting on his porch, drink in hand, waiting. Rutala and Toma rode in the government car with Seth and Kenan. As they came up the road, she saw an old farmhouse, lights on. The government had granted her and Toma something they called sanctuary. Her ship had disappeared, and after debriefing the brothers, the commanding officer had agreed to let them go home. She was surprised when it was Kenan who demanded her and Toma accompany them. The commanding officer seemed amused at his defiance and granted it. They were all going to be returned to the base for a while when this visit was done. As they pulled up to the farmhouse, an older human female walked out on the porch to stand next to the man sitting there. The brothers bolted from the car, making headway towards the house. She and Toma got out and followed slowly, not sure what kind of response to expect from this race for taking their young. They'd been gone 8 years. The boys were now 16 and 17. That is when Kenan introduced her to his family. He said nothing about her role in taking them away, just told his parents how she'd protected them and brought them home. Thus began her life among the humans. While living there, she was amazed and horrified by what she saw and heard. Wars were a daily thing, fighting was a sport, yet love was not rare, and they had arts the likes of which she'd never seen. They were far wilder than anything she could have ever envisioned. Over the next couple of years, she watched as Kenan and Seth taught the humans not just what the technology did, but how to make it and how it worked. Their understanding quickly appeared to far exceed anything she had envisioned. She watched in awe at how quickly the human scientists not only learned, but adapted this technology in new ways. She also found that you had to be careful, as several times she witnessed them doing absurdly dangerous tests. Yet from each, they learned and understood how things worked a little better and developed more technology. One morning, reading the research report from the prior day, realization hit her. Humans were the wildlings of the galaxy. They learned how something worked and were then crazy enough to try and manipulate it. Where all other species in the galaxy lived by its rules, these humans, or wildlings, manipulated them. They did not accept the status quo, even from the very forces of nature. And, at the boys' insistence, they watched The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars. Afterwards, Toma leaned over. No wonder they weren't shocked. Not sure if I just watched their past or our future. Commander Smith was strapped into the first FTL-capable spaceship humanity had ever built. Humanity exploded into space recently, as both commercial and government bodies raced to colonize and expand. Now he was about to make history, and as the countdown counted down, He felt a pit in his stomach. The FTL drive had been on the brink of discovering in the 1990s, but budget cuts had stopped the research. Now it was real, and he was about to make history, only 80 years later. At 0, he punched the FTL button, launching the wildling into the void of space. Humanity, the wildlings of space, had returned. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.